The AMP project, or also known as Google AMP, is a new way to deliver fast pages to mobile users. But it's not without controversy, mostly because it requires a new HTML syntax to work properly and a fair amount of template work. But the promise is a big one: faster pages and maybe better search rankings. So in this lesson, we will plug into AMP, learn what it is, how it works, and then step through a simple implementation of AMP. So let's turn it up to 11. AMP stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. It's an open source framework driven by Google with the goal of delivering faster pages to mobile users. Google has been pushing web page performance for several years. If you watch my web performance testing course, you know this based on how they potentially weight faster pages versus slower pages in their search results. However, AMP, which is driven by Google, is an implementation that helps you create faster pages, not just help you measure them like some of the other Google tools that we know about. So instead of providing the tools to measure fast pages, Google has helped create a tool so you can create those fast pages too. AMP is a three-part system. There's AMP HTML, a custom HTML syntax that is parsed by the AMP engine. There's AMP.js, which is the JavaScript library that is the engine that supports the HTML implementation, and AMP Cache, a CDN that caches and serves AMP documents and assets via HTTP 2. The goal with AMP is to have a fast page load with a single HTTP request. And the limitations of AMP encourage lean HTML documents. You're limited to what you can do on the page. And when you cannot do a lot, you really have to slim down your template. So let's talk about how a template will look in Google AMP. This is an implemented version of an AMP document, and the first thing you'll notice is the AMP property on the HTML element. Then we also have a link here with the rel of canonical, and this links off to the canonical version of this article. I am using a different template for my AMP page, and because of that, I need to tell Google where the canonical version is. This one is the one that isn't amplified, so to say. So it's pointing to the normal page that would be delivered for everybody that isn't looking for an AMP version of this page. And what happens is on the normal version, on the canonical version of the page, there'll be a link back to this AMP version as well, so that way Google can discover it while it's crawling to index for its search engine. You'll also notice that CSS here is all right in the template. And this is on purpose because one of the requirements of AMP is that all CSS has to be in the template, has to be inlined in the template. There is no external CSS files allowed. Why do they do that? Well, obviously for performance reasons. They want to have one big payload to deliver instead of having to fetch a bunch of different resources. Further down, we have a script tag here. This is the engine that makes AMP run. It's pulled in asynchronously, and you can point this to anywhere that you're hosting this, but I'm pointing it right at the AMP project CDN, and so that loads hopefully as fast as any source of this JavaScript file would load. Further down, we get into my content, and one thing here is you can see that I'm loading in the logo using amp-img, and this is that special image element that you have to use in order to have this validate under AMP. And it's amp-img. We'll talk about all the main elements later, and we'll also talk about some of the components that you can extend AMP with. So let's look at how AMP loads in the browser. So this is the canonical version of an article on the blog, and if I do /amp, it will load an AMP version. And as you can see, it's just a very simple version of the site. It's very lean, however, it has all the content that I would want there, and it will work very well because it's very fast. Another one I want to look at is one here by Matt Mullenweg. Of course, Matt is one of the creators of WordPress, and he runs Automattic. And of course, WordPress worked with the AMP project team to have a WordPress plugin available. And there is one available, and I assume that's what Matt is using since his site runs WordPress. And this is a turnkey solution essentially for turning AMP on for your WordPress site. So if you're running WordPress, this is a great way to go. But again, if we go to his post here about Lent and I just add AMP and load that to it, then you can see that it loads an AMP version of this article. And just like we showed here on mine, it's a simplified version of the article. And again, that's on purpose. It's meant to be very lean. It's meant to be 100% content focused. And by doing those things and by working within the restrictions of the AMP project and the AMP syntax, that we only have a few things that we can do, and it really helps us focus on the content. Probably have some questions about AMP, so let's address some typical questions that may come up. The first one is, does using AMP replace your normal performance improvements that you should do? And the answer is no. It's only meant for improving mobile pages, especially content pages like articles and blog posts that we just saw in those two examples. You can create AMP pages for every page on your site if you want, but I would recommend starting with your main content pages, the most important content pages, and then moving on from there. The next question is, do you have to use AMP? The answer is no, you don't. You can ignore it completely. This isn't some new standard for HTML that you have to adopt. It's just an extra piece that the team behind AMP is introducing. Does it help with SEO? Well, we know that Google values fast pages, and Google is behind this AMP project. So there's probably a good assumption that can be made that if you adopt AMP and you have fast mobile pages, that you will get an improvement in your ranking in the search engine. Also, is there anything that you have to sign up for to use AMP? And of course the answer is no. It's an open source project. You can use it or not use it. There's nothing to have approved or to sign up for or anything like that. Earlier I referred to the three different parts of AMP: AMP HTML, AMP JavaScript, and AMP Cache. I want to look at each one in a little bit more depth so we can understand how the different pieces of AMP come together to make the whole thing work. We'll start with AMP HTML. AMP HTML is a set of custom HTML elements and parameters that AMP requires in order to validate as an AMP HTML document. The HTML elements all use the AMP- prefix. There are two types of AMP HTML elements. We have the core elements, which you can use in a standard AMP setup, and there's the extended component elements, which are not supported by the standard AMP JavaScript library, but will require additional JavaScript libraries to function. Let's review the core elements first. The first one is AMP image. This replaces the standard image element, and AMP requires that you use this element instead of the standard image element. If you have images embedded in your content, this will require some work to implement. This element is what's called runtime managed, and that means that the AMP library parses it for its own uses at runtime, but still allows the browser to render the image normally as if it were a standard image element. The AMP image element requires the dimension properties, so AMP knows the dimensions of the image that it's fetching without having to fetch it to find that out. If you use the AMP image element without specifying the dimensions, then AMP will suppress the image completely and it will not be rendered as part of the AMP powered page. The next one is AMP video, and this replaces the video element that you'd use to embed video right in your page. You can use it exactly as you'd use the video, except that the source of the video must be HTTPS. And then AMP embed. AMP embed is used to embed elements on the page just like the embed element would. There's also AMP add. This is an ad display container that supports about a dozen ad networks, and you can check the AMP documentation for the latest network support to see if yours is there. The ads in an AMP ad container must be served via HTTPS. And also there's AMP Pixel. AMP Pixel allows pixel tracking in your AMP pages. Next up is AMP.js. AMP.js is a JavaScript library that you link to in your AMP HTML document. and AMP.js is the engine behind processing an AMP page. The AMP.js library also manages all of the resources when they're loaded externally via the AMP cache, and it prevents render blocking by loading all sources asynchronously. This is really the engine behind AMP. The next one is AMP cache. AMP cache is where AMP stores your AMP document data and from where it serves that data when your page is requested. Google hosts an AMP cache that everyone is free to use at no cost. This cache can store copies of your AMP pages and deliver them to site visitors that request an AMP page that is stored in cache. This allows the page to be delivered as quickly as possible via Google CDN. The nice thing is that AMP handles all of this for you behind the scenes. You don't have to do anything except implement your HTML document using AMP. So how do we implement AMP on our site? Well, let's go ahead and jump and use my Majingo site as a sample. We'll look again at that blog post template, and we're going to implement it using AMP. Now, the reason I started with the blog post template is because I just wanted to do one section that was content focused and fairly simple. So what we're going to do is we'll create the template using our base AMP code, and then we'll add some variables to it to make it dynamic. And in this example, I'm using the Expression Engine CMS, but the details of the CMS don't matter much unless you have a plug-and-play plugin that allows you to turn AMP on like you can do with WordPress. Let's jump in and get started with that. Okay, I created a amp.html document, and this is the template in my CMS that I will use to deliver these amplified pages. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and put in some base markup here. So we have our doc type here and our HTML, head and body. All right, the first thing we need to do in our AMP HTML is add AMP, and we'll add our language. And now I want to go ahead and add in a bit more markup here. And then we have our title, which we can fill in like this for now. And the next thing I want to do is link off to the canonical version of this article. So we'll do rel equals canonical and the link. And in this case, I'm going to leave it blank because we'll come in and fill it in with the variable for the CMS to have it populate that. So now I'm going to drop in some more stuff here. And what we have here are a few important things. First off, we are linking to some fonts in Google Fonts. Now remember I said that we can't use services right now like Typekit. I use Huffler for Whitney. We can't use that. So I'm going to use Open Sans for this implementation of AMP on my site, just because it's a simple typeface and it reads well and it looks fine for these amplified pages. We also have our viewport tag there and also some schema.org data as well. Next, I want to add the boilerplate styles from AMP, and this is required in your AMP document. This is stuff that's just part of AMP, and you'll be able to get this either from my example or from the AMP project website at ampproject.org. They'll have all the boilerplate there for you. We want to drop that in so everything is functioning, and below that we can drop in our custom CSS. So to do that, you do style and then AMP custom, like that, and then we'll close the style tag, and in between here is where we drop in our custom styles. Now I kept this very simple for my site. You can see I only have a few styles here. There's not much going on, and I did that on purpose because I wanted this to be as simple as possible so it's as fast as possible. So don't forget that you have to put any styles for your AMP pages in this style tag using amp-custom. You can't load CSS files externally, even if they're on your own server. AMP won't honor them, nor will it validate your document as a valid AMP document. And of course, before we forget, we need to add in our script tag that points to our AMP JavaScript file. and we're just loading it from the AMP project CDN, and that is the meat and potatoes, I would say, behind AMP. It's the engine that makes AMP go. So we want to make sure we include that as well. All right, now we're ready to look at some content. I'm just going to drop all of this in at once here. And what we have, we'll walk through together. So I just have a top bar. I called this AMP top bar only to call it out, so I know that it's specific to AMP. And that's referenced up here in my CSS. And I have the logo, and you can see, as we looked at earlier, I'm calling in the image for the logo, and I have to use amp-img. I have to use a special element. The standard image element won't work. And I'm specifying the width and height here, and then it's closing here with an amp-image closing element. And I link that whole thing, so it points to the home page of the site. So if people want to go and view the rest of the site, they can get to it easily. That's one thing to keep in mind, is you want to give them an exit route out of these AMP pages, whether that's through some standard navigation, through linking the logo, or through something else at the bottom of the article. You want to give them a way of getting out of it. We don't want this to be a walled garden where this amplified page is just stuck on its own, like an MDOT site where there's this mobile version and you have to go to desktop site. We don't want that. We want to give them the ability to click off, and in this case they'll just go to the home page when they click on the logo, and it'll be the responsive version of the site, so of course it'll look perfectly fine on any device. All right, and then we have our content. So this is the main content of my page right here. Looks like I need to close my div. All right, so I have an H1, and then I have my body of my blog posts. Now you can ignore all of these curly braces and everything. These are just variables for Expression Engine. And one thing I'm doing here that I want to note is I am finding image tags in the content, and I'm replacing them with image amp so that they are have the proper element. I still have not worked around getting height and width attributes in there. And so that's something that, again, this is not going to be a perfect implementation. You will have some trade-offs. In this case, those images will be ignored. And so I need to go back and fix that so the images will actually work. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can put the height and width in the content itself, or you can do programmatically. If you look at the source of the WordPress plugin that was created for AMP, you see that they're doing something similar. They are finding and replacing in the content at runtime. And that's something that I'm doing here as well, but at a much more rudimentary level than what other implementations have. So that's how I'm pulling in my blog body right there. All right, the only thing left here is I need to load in my channel entries. And this is, again, just an Expression Engine thing. And then at the bottom, I need to close this. All right, let's save that. And now let's go and see how this works on our site. Oh, one thing I forgot to do is put in my canonical URL. So I'm just pointing to the main post here, which is the normal template for this blog post. So Google knows the canonical version of this, and that this is not we don't get duplicate content issues, but also Google knows that this is not the canonical version. All right, there we go. And now if we look at it, let's take a look. So this is the normal version right here. And I have set up the routing for my site so that if I add /amp, it'll use that AMP template we just created. If we do that, there you go. You see that we have everything looking good right here. And if we look at the source, you can see here's our AMP document, has all of our stuff. Right here, it's got the canonical version. It looks like it's pulling in our fonts, looking good. It's not Whitney, doesn't look as nice as Whitney, but hey, it's also a very readable page that is perfect for people that just want to get the content, and perhaps we don't need to be so concerned about the typeface at this point. So the last thing I want to do is on the main template is point to this AMP version. So we're pointing the AMP version to the canonical version, and I want to go to the canonical version and point to the AMP version so they're linked. So I'm going to go into my template, and again, this is all specific to Expression Engine, so these examples aren't super important. But one of the things I'm doing here is I am setting a layout variable, in this case called AMP, and I'm passing in the permalink to this blog post. And then in my wrapper up top here, I'm just checking to see if that's AMP, a layout variable is available. And if it is, I'm doing link rel AMP HTML, all one word, href, and then the URL, which is what this variable outputs. And then that will populate rel AMP HTML with the full URL to the AMP version. And now those two are linked. So when that page is indexed, we're saying, hey, we have an AMP version of this page. Please index this and deliver mobile users this page instead of the normal page. And our AMP page and our AMP implementation is done. So you can see this up on Majingo. If we go to my Start a Course for Free, you can see if I add AMP to it, it works perfectly. And if I go to the canonical version of that article, there it is right there. Can view source and go to the head. And you can see here's the link to the AMP HTML version right there. It's just basically the same URL but /AMP. And that way those two articles are linked. So we have our AMP document here, but how do we test it to make sure that it is working properly? We want to make sure it validates, that we're not missing anything or we made a mistake. Well, the AMP project gives you an easy way to do that. You just use hash or # and then development equals 1. Load any URL with that, and that will put us in validation mode. And if we look at our developer tools in Chrome, you can see it says powered by AMP right here. And if I reload that again, now you can see it says AMP validation successful. So we're good, we validated. All right, let's break something and see what happens. So back in my template, I'm going to remove this AMP image element and make it a standard image element and see what happens. Let's reload again. All right, so now we have validation errors. It says the tag image may only appear as a descendant of a tag NoScript, which means if there's no JavaScript available, you can use image tags. But it's saying, did you mean AMP image? And indeed we did. You can get the full trace here if you needed to. It'll give you a link off to the documentation for the AMP project. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we'll undo it and save it and reload. And now we're back to validating. So while you're working, while you're building out, use hash development equals 1 in Chrome. Open the developer tools in Chrome. Make sure you can see the console, and then check that you're always getting the message AMP validation successful. And if you are, you're ready to merge that into your master branch and deploy out and be on your way with amplified pages for your site. Earlier, I talked about the AMP HTML elements that you have to use, and they're very limited. But I also said that we could use some other components that were extensions of AMP that will give us more of the features of a web page that we're used to, things like carousels and accordions. All of that stuff is not allowed in AMP, so we can't pull in an accordion via some JavaScript library. That just won't work. But AMP does provide what's called extended components to do that. And you can see some good examples. There's a whole list of them in the AMP project documentation. But what extended components are is that they allow you to support some functionality that's not part of the standard AMP JavaScript library. To use the components, you need to include the component-specific code, a link out to the component-specific JavaScript library, and in the documentation here you can see some examples like here's AMP accordion, and this gives you an accordion. You can outline your content with an accordion and collapse it and allow your visitor to jump around between it, and it requires that you use this script here. and it's pulled in asynchronously, of course, and has the custom element attribute called amp accordion, and then the source is served over HTTPS. And then you can use that right here using the amp accordion tag and then using this markup. So again, this is one of the challenges of AMP, is that you do have to play by the AMP rules, and it's almost like you have to re-implement everything. So if you really wanted to go full out, if you had a very media-rich page and you wanted to go full out, you would have to author these templates over again using all new markup, and most likely at least adapted CSS, if not all new CSS. So it's one thing to keep in mind. All right, let's look at another one that might be popular, is carousel. Everybody loves a carousel. Here's AMP carousel. And this is just they call it a generic carousel. Allows you to display content in a horizontal fashion. And here it is, the AMP carousel tag with a width and a height. And then you can have your AMP images inside of those, also with the width and height properties, because those are required. All right, another one that's closer to home for me, because I do a lot of video, of course, is AMP Vimeo, which is right here. There's also AMP Vine and AMP YouTube. Let's look at AMP Vimeo. It allows you to display a Vimeo video. You do have to include this custom script for Vimeo, the Vimeo library. And here's an example of the code. AMP Vimeo. You put in the ID of the video, very cool, the layout you want, and then the width and the height, and then close AMP Video. Pretty cool stuff. So as you can see, there's a whole list of these extended components that you can use. If there isn't one available, there are ways of contributing to the project and including one. However, you can see that there is a challenge here, because now we suddenly find ourselves having to implement a bunch of different markup that we don't already have on our site. So if you want to roll AMP out across your entire site, it may not be a simple one-day straightforward job, but as I said before, a great place to start is in the most important content area of your site, whether that's blog posts or articles or whatever you offer on your site. Start there first, start simple, get used to AMP, get used to working with the AMP markup, and then grow it from there. So those are the basics of the AMP project. I hope you got a lot of value out of learning what AMP is, how you can implement it, and gives you the steps you need to get started on your own site. I'm Ryan Ireland from Majingo.com. Check out everything that we have here at Majingo. Go to majingo.com/learn to see all of our courses. Thanks a lot, and happy amping.